Pine Hill wasn't just any town, it was the kind of place where life moved a little slower, where neighbors gathered for barbecues, and everyone felt safe leaving their doors unlocked. It had always been a picture of peace and simplicity, a place where people chose to raise their families away from the hustle and unpredictability of big cities. But that image was shattered with Jennifer Johnson's murder. Suddenly, the town everyone thought they knew so well seemed different. It was a shock to the system. People found themselves questioning the safety of their quiet streets and wondering if they truly knew their neighbors as well as they'd thought. Pine Hill had changed overnight, and an unease settled over the town. Parents held their children a little closer, and even simple routines like evening walks or a small talk at the local diner felt different. The murder had forced everyone to confront a reality they'd never expected in their tight-knit community. As investigators arrived and set to work, Pine Hill held its breath. The residents couldn't help but wonder, was this crime the result of a stranger passing through, or was there something hidden within their own circle? The sense of community was shaken, and the once comfortable familiarity of Pine Hill was now cloaked in mystery and fear. Among the residents of Pine Hill were two couples who had become close friends over the years, Daniel and Linda Garner, and Mark and Jennifer Johnson. They weren't just casual acquaintances. They were the kind of friends who shared vacations, dinners, and long conversations into the night. Both couples appeared to live happy, settled lives with steady jobs and strong family ties. Daniel was a respected architect known around town for his friendly nature and creative designs, while his wife Linda was a dedicated school teacher who had a soft spot for her students. The Johnsons, who had moved to Pine Hill a few years ago, fit right in. Mark, a financial advisor, was outgoing and always up for a laugh, and Jennifer was known for her charm and warm personality. Together, the Garners and Johnsons quickly became inseparable. But as their friendship grew, so did layers that no one else in Pine Hill could see. Beneath the friendly gatherings and the laughter, a more complicated side of their relationships began to unfold. In time, they would realize that their connections weren't as simple as they appeared, and those hidden parts would lead to consequences none of them were prepared for. What started as a close friendship between the Garners and Johnsons took an unexpected turn one evening during a casual dinner party. Over a few too many glasses of wine, the conversation drifted into uncharted territory. The idea of an open relationship came up, and instead of the shock or laughter you might expect, there was a surprising curiosity in the air. In the weeks that followed, this idea lingered, becoming a real topic of discussion between the two couples. Boundaries were set, rules were agreed upon, and it all seemed like a harmless way to bring a spark of adventure into their lives. What started as an occasional, almost playful experiment soon turned into a regular arrangement that added a new level of excitement to their routines. At first, it was thrilling, a shared secret that brought both couples closer in unexpected ways. They believed they'd found a balance, a way to keep things exciting without crossing any lines that might threaten their primary relationships. But as the novelty wore off, subtle shifts began to show, hinting that this new arrangement might be leading them somewhere dangerous. As time went on, what had once felt thrilling started to grow complicated, especially for Daniel. The arrangement, which was meant to be a light-hearted addition to their lives, began to change him. His attention shifted, and he found himself drawn to Jennifer in ways he hadn't anticipated. What began as fascination quietly deepened into something else, something that was harder to control. Linda noticed these small changes in her husband. She could tell that he was becoming distant, distracted even when they were together. But she pushed her doubts aside, telling herself that it was just a phase, a temporary excitement that would soon pass. Mark, on the other hand, seemed blissfully unaware of the tension building around him, confident in the boundaries they had all agreed upon. Yet, Daniel's interest in Jennifer grew stronger, and it wasn't long before he was looking for more ways to be near her. Whether it was finding reasons to meet up or making excuses to spend time alone, he was becoming consumed. What had started as a harmless agreement between friends was slowly unraveling, with emotions and attachments none of them had planned for. Jennifer soon began to sense that Daniel's feelings for her had crossed the line. What once felt like harmless attention now felt intense, even unsettling. His glances lingered longer, his conversations became more personal, and his presence seemed to carry a weight that made her increasingly uncomfortable. She realized that the arrangement, which was supposed to be a temporary thrill, had grown into something she no longer wanted. So Jennifer made the decision to end it. She believed that by stepping away, things would return to normal, and everyone could move on without any harm done. But what Jennifer couldn't foresee was how Daniel would react. His feelings weren't something he could just turn off, and her decision to put a stop to their arrangement only fueled his obsession further. Jennifer's attempt to create distance only made him more determined. The more she pulled away, the more Daniel tried to hold on. It was a decision that, instead of bringing relief, set off a series of events that would spiral far beyond her control. As Daniel's obsession grew, he started finding every possible excuse to be near Jennifer. It was no longer just about casual gatherings or friendly visits. He volunteered to handle tasks that Mark would normally take care of, and he invited the Johnsons over more frequently, each time hoping for even a few minutes alone with Jennifer. Linda watched with growing unease. At first, she brushed off his fixation as lingering excitement from their arrangement, but as the days passed, it became impossible to ignore. Daniel's behavior was changing, and it was no longer about their agreed boundaries, it was personal. He spoke about Jennifer in ways that hinted at a deeper attachment, mentioning small details about her that Linda knew weren't part of their friendship. For Jennifer, Daniel's attention had become overbearing. She tried to keep things polite, hoping he would respect the limits she was trying to set, but his persistence only made her more anxious. What she once saw as playful had now become an intense fixation she could no longer overlook, and it was clear that Daniel's intentions had crossed into dangerous territory. Jennifer's discomfort reached a peak during a weekend getaway the two couples had planned. They had rented a cabin by the lake, hoping to escape the routines of everyday life and reconnect. But the trip only served to highlight Daniel's growing fixation. Instead of relaxing and enjoying the time together as they usually would, Daniel seemed determined to monopolize Jennifer's attention. He insisted on taking her out on the lake alone, leaving Mark and Linda behind. Every small interaction became tense, and Jennifer's attempts to create space were met with subtle resistance from Daniel. His casual touches felt possessive, and his comments hinted at feelings that went far beyond their original agreement. One evening by the fire, Daniel let slip a remark that left Jennifer visibly shaken. He spoke in a way that suggested he wanted something more future, just the two of them. Jennifer, caught off guard, excused herself and went to bed early, disturbed by the direction his feelings had taken. Linda, having overheard the conversation, confronted Daniel once more, but he brushed her concerns aside. Yet both women knew that things had gone too far, and neither was sure what might happen next. Back in Pine Hill, Jennifer tried to distance herself even further from Daniel, hoping he would understand that their connection had to end completely. But Daniel wasn't willing to let go. His fascination had turned into something darker, an obsession that clouded his judgment and made him increasingly reckless. Instead of stepping back, he began showing up in places Jennifer hadn't expected: her yoga class, her workplace, even at times when she was alone. The situation had shifted from uncomfortable to alarming. Jennifer's sense of safety was slipping, and she confided in a close friend, sharing her growing concerns about Daniel's behavior. Her friend encouraged her to stay firm and, if necessary, cut off all ties with him. Determined to regain control, Jennifer made the decision to end all contact. But Daniel's fixation didn't waver. If anything, Jennifer's rejection fueled it further, pushing him to seek out ways to be closer to her, no matter the cost. As he grew more desperate, the boundaries that once kept their lives in balance began to unravel, leaving Jennifer feeling trapped in a situation that seemed to have no safe way out. One evening, while Mark was away on a business trip, Daniel showed up at the Johnsons' home unannounced. Jennifer, taken aback by his sudden visit, felt a chill but decided to let him in, hoping a calm conversation would finally put an end to his behavior. The air was thick with tension as they sat in the living room, and Daniel wasted no time confessing his intense feelings for her, talking about a future where they could be together openly. Jennifer, horrified, tried to reason with him, reminding him that their arrangement was never meant to go beyond its original boundaries. She explained that she loved her husband and was committed to her marriage. But the more she spoke, the more intense Daniel became, as if he couldn't hear the words she was saying. Realizing the conversation wasn't going anywhere safe, Jennifer told him firmly that their relationship, whatever it had been, was over. She urged him to respect her boundaries and move on. Daniel, visibly shaken and unable to process her rejection, tried one last time to convince her, but Jennifer held her ground. In the days that followed, she avoided him completely, hoping this final encounter would finally make him understand. But for Daniel, the rejection only deepened his obsession, and he was now more determined than ever to have her. After their final confrontation, Jennifer did everything she could to steer clear of Daniel, hoping he would finally take the hint and leave her alone. But his behavior only grew more erratic. Daniel started appearing outside her workplace, waiting for her after hours, and even left her unsettling messages, professing his feelings in ways that now felt desperate and alarming. Jennifer was at a breaking point. Feeling increasingly unsafe, she decided to confront him one last time, hoping to make him see reason. They agreed to meet in a secluded park, away from the eyes of anyone they knew. Jennifer arrived determined to put an end to the madness, but Daniel was already teetering on the edge. As she calmly explained that there was no future for them, his emotions boiled over, and he accused her of leading him on, playing with his feelings. Jennifer stood firm, insisting that whatever they had shared was over, and that he needed to respect her decision and move on with his life. Unbeknownst to them, Linda had followed Daniel to the park, sensing something was wrong. She watched from a distance, feeling a mix of dread and responsibility for the situation. As Daniel's anger flared, Jennifer held her ground, unwilling to let his obsession control her life any longer. But Linda knew this confrontation had reached a dangerous point, and she feared what Daniel might do next. The confrontation in the park left Daniel in turmoil. Jennifer's firm rejection, coupled with Linda's unexpected presence, shook him deeply. He returned home that night, filled with a mix of anger, confusion, and despair. Linda, sensing the storm brewing inside him, tried to reach out, but Daniel was unresponsive, lost in his own spiraling thoughts. In the days that followed, Daniel's behavior grew increasingly unstable. He stopped going to work, spending hours alone, replaying every interaction with Jennifer, fixating on her rejection as though it was a personal betrayal. Linda watched helplessly as her husband slipped further into darkness, her worry growing with each passing day. She could see that he was drifting away from reality, but she didn't know how to pull him back. Jennifer, meanwhile, was doing everything she could to rebuild a sense of normalcy. She avoided any place where she might run into Daniel, focusing on her work and her relationship with Mark. She hadn't told her husband the full extent of Daniel's obsession, fearing the consequences, but she hoped that by cutting him off completely, Daniel would eventually come to terms with the end of their arrangement. However, what she didn't realize was that Daniel's desperation was reaching a breaking point, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to confront his feelings head-on. One evening, as Jennifer returned home from work, she noticed Daniel waiting outside her house. Her heart sank, realizing this was not going to be just a casual encounter. Steeling herself, she approached him, her voice steady as she told him he needed to leave. But Daniel, his eyes wild with desperation, pleaded for a chance to explain himself one last time. Jennifer tried to brush past him, but Daniel grabbed her arm, his grip uncomfortably tight. The intensity in his eyes showed a man who had lost all sense of boundaries. As she struggled to break free, her voice rose, drawing the attention of a neighbor who stepped outside to see what was happening. The sight of the neighbor seemed to jolt Daniel back to reality, and he quickly released her before disappearing into the night. Shaken and fearful, Jennifer thanked her neighbor and hurried inside, her mind racing. She realized she couldn't handle this alone anymore. That night, she called Linda, hoping to find some way to deal with Daniel's increasingly unstable behavior without involving the police. Linda listened, torn between her loyalty to her husband and her concern for Jennifer's safety. They agreed to meet the next day to figure out a solution, but the conversation left both women realizing that things had spiraled far beyond their control. The next day, Jennifer and Linda met at a quiet cafe, away from prying eyes. Jennifer looked exhausted, the strain of the past weeks evident in her face as she recounted the encounter from the night before. She told Linda about her growing fear and the toll Daniel's behavior was taking on her life. Linda listened intently, realizing just how serious things had become. After their conversation, Linda returned home determined to confront Daniel. She found him pacing, his agitation evident. When she demanded an explanation for his actions, Daniel lashed out, accusing her of siding with Jennifer, of betraying him. The argument escalated quickly, with Linda retreating to their bedroom, shaken and unsure of what to do. That night, Daniel's thoughts turned darker. His obsession had twisted into something even he couldn't control. In his mind, Jennifer's rejection was an unforgivable betrayal, and the only way to ease his pain was to eliminate the source of it entirely. He convinced himself that if he couldn't have her, then no one else would, and this twisted resolve set him on a path from which there was no return. Late one night, Daniel made his way to the Johnsons' house, knowing Mark was out of town and Jennifer would be alone. Fueled by a mix of rage and desperation, he broke in quietly, slipping through a side window. The house was dark and silent, and he moved through it with single-minded purpose, heading straight to the bedroom where Jennifer lay asleep. The sight of her, peaceful and unaware, only seemed to deepen his anger. Gripping a kitchen knife, he approached her, his mind clouded by conflicting emotions of love and resentment. Jennifer awoke just as he reached her bedside, her eyes widening in terror as she realized the danger she was in. She tried to scream, but he covered her mouth, stifling her cries. In a moment of violent rage, Daniel took her life, silencing her forever. As he stood over her, the reality of his actions seemed to hit him all at once. The overwhelming mix of emotions faded, leaving only a hollow emptiness. Panicked and unsure of what to do next, Daniel fled the scene, his hands stained with blood and his mind struggling to process what he had done. Daniel returned home that night, trembling and disoriented, where Linda found him in a state of shock. One look at him, and she knew something terrible had happened. Without a word, she noticed the traces of blood on his hands and clothes, and the horrifying truth settled over her. Yet in that moment, her instinct wasn't to turn him in, it was to protect him, driven by a twisted loyalty and fear of losing everything. Linda took control, guiding him to the bathroom to wash off the blood, while she gathered his clothes and set about scrubbing any evidence that might link him to the crime. She worked methodically, her mind racing with thoughts of how to cover up what he had done. She knew they had to act fast and create an alibi, so she called a close friend, ensuring they could account for Daniel's whereabouts that night. Once Daniel had calmed down enough to speak, Linda listened to his account, piecing together the grim details. She knew this was their only chance to keep their secret life from unraveling completely. So later that night, she took his blood-stained clothes and the weapon, driving out to a secluded spot outside of town where she burned everything, hoping that the fire would destroy any evidence that could connect them to the crime. In the days that followed, the police began their investigation, questioning neighbors and friends to piece together the events leading up to Jennifer's murder. Naturally, they spoke with the Garners, given their close friendship with the Johnsons. Linda's carefully crafted alibi held up under scrutiny, and Daniel, though visibly shaken, managed to keep his emotions in check just enough to avoid suspicion. But while the investigation seemed stalled, the psychological toll weighed heavily on both of them. Daniel grew increasingly paranoid, convinced that every knock on the door or passing police car was a sign they were closing in on him. He withdrew from his usual routines, isolating himself as fear and guilt consumed him. Linda, on the other hand, remained outwardly composed, but she was constantly on edge, aware that the slightest slip could unravel their carefully constructed cover. She took on the role of managing their public appearances, ensuring they kept up the facade of grieving friends, while also trying to keep Daniel from breaking down. But despite her efforts, the tension between them and within their own minds grew, and they both knew that this fragile web of lies could only hold for so long. As the investigation dragged on, Linda realized that simply maintaining their alibi wouldn't be enough. They needed to shift attention away from themselves entirely. To do this, she suggested that Daniel show more outward signs of grief, to align with the community's mourning and make his presence at public gatherings seem natural. Daniel, though struggling internally, managed to play the part, speaking of Jennifer with sadness and joining Mark in expressing shock and sorrow over her loss. Meanwhile, Mark, devastated and desperate for answers, leaned on Daniel for support, never suspecting his friend's involvement. The two men would talk about Jennifer, with Daniel masking his guilt under the guise of empathy, his performance convincing enough to maintain Mark's trust. But while Daniel was able to play the grieving friend in public, his mental state continued to unravel behind closed doors. Nightmares plagued his sleep, and he turned to drinking heavily, finding only fleeting escape in alcohol. Linda, realizing how close he was to breaking down, became even more vigilant, watching him closely and trying to keep him grounded, all while fearing that one wrong move would bring their world crashing down. Despite Linda's efforts to keep things under control, rumors began to circulate in Pine Hill. Daniel's increased drinking and erratic behavior hadn't gone unnoticed, and some of their friends started to whisper that something didn't add up. People who once trusted the Garners now viewed them with a mix of suspicion and curiosity, sensing that there was more to the story than they were letting on. Aware of these shifting perceptions, Linda worked tirelessly to squash any gossip, making sure they remained above reproach. She kept up appearances, managing their public interactions, and speaking fondly of Jennifer whenever the opportunity arose, hoping to dispel any doubts about their innocence. However, the mounting pressure was taking a toll on her as well. She became hyper-alert, analyzing every conversation and watching for any signs of suspicion from their neighbors. She knew that even one small mistake could unravel everything. And with Daniel's increasingly unstable behavior, the once solid facade they had built was beginning to show cracks. In the back of her mind, Linda understood that they were running out of time, and that the truth was inching closer to the surface with each passing day. As the police investigation continued, a breakthrough finally arrived. Detectives uncovered inconsistencies in Daniel's alibi, along with forensic evidence that didn't line up with the initial statements. They began to re-examine his and Linda's accounts, questioning whether the couple was as uninvolved as they had claimed. Detective Mitchell, who had been quietly following the case, felt her suspicions deepen and decided it was time to dig further. First, Mitchell requested Jennifer's phone records, which revealed a series of increasingly intense and desperate messages from Daniel leading up to her death. Combined with statements from neighbors who remembered seeing Daniel's car near the Johnsons' house on the night of the murder, this new information painted a disturbing picture. Mitchell knew she was closing in and prepared to bring Daniel in for another round of questioning, determined to push him to his breaking point. When Daniel was confronted, he struggled to maintain his composure. The detective pressed him on every inconsistency, hinting that they had more evidence than he knew. As the questions intensified, Daniel's nerves began to show, his answers turning evasive and defensive. For the first time, he felt the full weight of the net closing around him, and it was only a matter of time before he cracked under the pressure. The pressure mounted when a key witness came forward, a neighbor who vividly recalled seeing Daniel's car parked near the Johnsons' home on the night of Jennifer's murder. This testimony, paired with the phone records and Daniel's erratic behavior, was enough for the police to secure a search warrant for the Garners' residence. During the search, detectives uncovered remnants of burned clothing and faint traces of blood that had seeped into the floorboards, remnants Linda hadn't been able to fully erase. These discoveries provided the physical evidence they needed to tie Daniel to the crime scene. Suddenly, the Garners' carefully crafted alibi unraveled as the damning clues came to light. With the evidence piling up, Linda and Daniel could feel the walls closing in. They knew their time was running out, and the lies they had woven so meticulously were beginning to collapse. Facing the reality of the situation, Linda realized that their only hope of escape would be to shift the blame entirely, but even she knew that might be too little, too late.